Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. The air crash we are discussing today is unprecedented in history. A Boeing 737 carrying 54 people actually got lost mid-flight. A 48-minute journey ended up lasting 3 hours. And the 3-hour flight was only because the fuel could only last that long. In other words, the aircraft eventually ran out of fuel. Fortunately, the emergency landing was relatively smooth. Although the plane broke apart, most of the people survived. Regarding this crash, the most bizarre part is how it happened. It seemed almost deliberate, but in reality, it was unintentional because there were simply too many errors throughout the process. If even one mistake hadn't been made, we wouldn't have this story today. So what exactly happened in this air disaster? Let's first travel back to Brazil in 1989 to review the details of the crash. Brazil is located in eastern South America, with a land area ranking 5th in the world. In Latin America, it is the largest and most populous country. Of course, most people's impression of Brazil is as a football powerhouse. Here, football is a sport loved by almost everyone. On the streets and on the beaches, you can see football being played. Brazil even has the reputation of being the kingdom of football. September 3rd, 1989. This day was unforgettable for both Brazilians and Chileans, because the 1990 World Cup qualifiers, the final round for the South American zone, kicked off on this day. The outcome of the match would directly determine which of their countries would advance. Brazil's major television stations and radio stations were almost all broadcasting the match live. At this time, at Sao Paulo's Guarulhos International Airport, a large group of people, just like any other day, were boarding the scheduled flight from Sao Paulo to Belém. The flight was Varig Flight 254. The aircraft for this flight was a Boeing 737, model 737-200. It was one of Boeing's earlier models. To keep things brief, we will refer to this aircraft as Flight 254. This Brazilian airline route was different from the direct routes we usually talk about. The plane flew from Sao Paulo in the south to Belém in the north, making stops at 6 airports along the way. They were Uberaba, Uberlândia, Goiânia, Brasília, Imperatriz, and Maraba. The final stop was Belém. Due to the many stops, the total flight time for the entire route was 8 hours and 20 minutes. With such a long flight time, it was necessary to change the flight crew midway. At 9:43 a.m., the plane took off normally from Sao Paulo. The first few stops went very smoothly. At 1:22 p.m., the plane landed at Brasília International Airport. Here, the crew changed. A new crew took over for the second half of the flight. Let's focus on this new flight crew. The captain was 32-year-old César Garcês. He was a very skilled pilot. He was a former Air Force pilot with a total of 7,000 flight hours, 1,000 of which were on the Boeing 737. The first officer was 29-year-old Nilson Zill. He was relatively new, having been with the company for just over a year. He only had 884 flight hours, with 442 hours on the Boeing 737. Besides the 2 pilots, there were 4 flight attendants. At 2:51 p.m., the plane landed at Imperatriz Airport. At 5 p.m., it landed at Maraba Airport. Only one last stop remained. But this leg of the journey would become the final journey for some. Flight 254 made its final preparations at Maraba Airport. At this time, besides the 6 crew members, there were 48 passengers on board. Captain Garcês also received the flight plan to Belém. At that time, Brazilian Airlines were preparing to computerize their flight plans. But Flight 254, due to its older model, was not yet equipped with a modern flight management computer. It still relied on traditional radio navigation aids. Based on the paper flight plan, some data had to be entered manually. The captain set the magnetic heading to 270 degrees based on the plan, and the flight performance management system to 215 kilometers. The performance management system, while it couldn't tell you where the plane was, could, based on the set distance, tell you roughly how long until you reached the destination. The aircraft could adjust its altitude and speed based on this, which improved the plane's fuel efficiency. First Officer Zill, seeing the numbers the captain had set, also entered the same settings. At 5:35 p.m., the plane was ready and took off into the sunset. It quickly reached an altitude of 29,000 feet. This leg was only 215 kilometers, expected to take only 48 minutes. So everyone was very relaxed, thinking they'd be there after a short chat. After flying safely for 23 minutes, the captain glanced at the performance management system. They were not far from the destination. It was time to descend. He asked Zil to contact the Belém ground controller. That's when the first problem appeared. No matter how they called, they couldn't reach Belém's air traffic control. Later, the captain tried calling himself, still no response. Then, the second problem occurred. The aircraft could not receive the beacon signal from Belém Airport. At that time, aircraft were not as advanced as they are today. They had to track the signal emitted by the airport's VOR beacon to confirm the runway's location before they could land. Being unable to receive the Belém Airport beacon meant they couldn't find the airport, or the plane wasn't even near the airport. This problem was serious. The captain decided to use high-frequency HF radio to contact Belém ATC. Let's try HF radio. The advantage of HF radio is long-distance communication, whereas very high-frequency, VHF, is only suitable for short-range signal transmission, typically used for communication between aircraft and ground control, or between aircraft. Using the HF radio, Belém Airport indeed received their signal. The captain was relieved. He quickly reported that the plane was approaching Belém Airport, but couldn't receive the airport beacon, asking if there was a problem with the beacon. But the ground controller replied that the beacon was working normally, no problems at all. The captain's first reaction was, could there be something wrong with the plane? According to the performance manager, the plane was already very close to Belém Airport. The captain used dead reckoning to estimate their position, calculating they were about 25 minutes from the airport. So they requested to descend. After receiving permission, they descended to 20,000 feet. It was now past 6 p.m. and the sky was getting dark. Logically, the city of Belém should be lit up with thousands of lights. But as the plane descended below the clouds, it was still pitch black below. There were no landmarks visible. Like the Amazon River, Belém is located at the mouth of the Amazon River. Clearly something was very wrong. At this point, the first officer said, I think we overshot it. The performance manager showed we had already flown past it by 30 miles. The captain had a realization, oh, so that's the problem. No wonder we couldn't find the airport, so they made a 180-degree turn. The passengers were also very confused. What's going on today? Usually, we should be landing by now and be able to see the city below. Why is it pitch black today, and the plane is turning around? Some passengers began to get nervous. 3 passengers who frequently took this flight approached a flight attendant, saying the plane was flying in the wrong direction and was probably lost. They hoped the flight attendant would inform the captain. But the flight attendant just reassured them not to worry, that the plane would be landing soon. They did not contact the cockpit. After turning the plane around, the captain continued to contact the tower, stating the plane was now on approach and requesting descent to 4,000 feet and reducing speed to 200 knots. But even after descending, they still couldn't find the airport. The ground was pitch black with no guidance whatsoever. They could only keep flying. Fortunately, they had refueled at the last airport, so the plane could fly for at least another 3 hours. For now, the fuel was sufficient. After repeatedly failing to find the airport, the captain started to feel uneasy. He understood that something must have gone wrong, causing the plane to get lost. Normally, he could have used the HF radio to ask for help, but he didn't. Instead, he decided to tune the plane's radio direction finder to Belém's broadcast radio station. This way, the station could guide the plane back onto the correct heading. This method was indeed feasible, and they successfully found a station. At that time, the station was broadcasting the exciting match between Brazil and Chile. This time, the captain and first officer finally felt relieved. The plane followed the broadcast signal, adjusted its direction, and continued flying. Soon, a large river appeared on the plane's radar. The Amazon River. This word immediately popped into the captain's mind. He was completely reassured now, because Belém is at the mouth of the Amazon. As long as they followed the river, they should arrive in Belém soon, barring any surprises. So they abandoned the radio station's guidance and flew along the river as a reference. But, the unexpected happened, because the river that appeared on the plane's radar was not the Amazon River at all. It was the Shingo River. We can take a look at these two rivers. One flows north-south, the other flows east-west. They are in completely different locations. This critical error caused much of the information the captain reported to Belém ATC to be wrong, such as their position. And the captain and crew were still unaware. Crucially, in his confusion, the captain also mistook Santarém Airport for Maraba Airport. Although these two airports' locator frequencies were the same, their radio beacon identification codes were different. The captain and first officer somehow failed to notice this. You have to realize one of these airports is in the south, the other in the north, over 1,000 kilometers apart. So, the plane continued to fly incorrectly, in the wrong location. At 8:30 p.m., the plane also missed a nearby Air Force base called Kachimbo. At that time, they were only 190 kilometers from this base. If they had made an emergency landing at this airport, they might not have ended up crashing. At 8:45 p.m., after flying for more than 3 hours, the plane's fuel was exhausted. The captain had to make an announcement, telling the passengers the grim truth. Due to a navigation system failure, and after running out of fuel, they would have to make an emergency landing in the rainforest. The captain tried to keep the plane at a speed slightly above stalling, 150 knots, to ensure the plane wouldn't stall, and to lessen the force of impact. As both engines flamed out, the 37-ton behemoth, in the pitch-black night, hurtled towards the endless forest. At this moment, the cabin, as one can imagine, was in total chaos. But there was nothing they could do. Some were crying. Some raised their hands in prayer. Some grabbed pillows to shield themselves, hoping to reduce the impact and save their lives. As they got closer and closer to the ground, the bottom of the plane first made contact with the treetops. The shaking began. The cries in the cabin grew louder. After passing through the dense branches, 2 thick trees tore off both of the plane's wings, causing the aircraft to twist violently. After a period of continuous impacts, the plane pitched to the right, crashed to the ground, and disintegrated. The saving grace was that there was no explosion. This was also because the plane was out of fuel. When the plane came to a complete stop, some people were thrown from the aircraft for not wearing seatbelts, resulting in serious injuries. Some were impaled by tree branches and severely injured. But compared to those who died instantly, just being alive was a blessing from heaven. Painful moans and desperate cries echoed through the dark jungle. Captain Garces also survived, and he was completely unharmed. But First Officer Zil suffered leg and shoulder fractures. His injuries were quite severe. The captain and a few uninjured passengers pulled all the survivors out of the wreckage. After a head count, of the 54 people on board, 48 had survived. Only 6 people died on impact. This number, for a plane crash, was undoubtedly a success. However, surviving the crash did not mean the danger was over. The plane had crashed in the Amazon rainforest at an unknown location. They lacked food and water. Waiting for rescue teams to arrive was their best option. Fortunately, the plane had an emergency locator transmitter, ELT, also called an emergency beacon. With such a violent crash, the beacon should have activated automatically. The captain even soaked the beacon in urine to increase the chance of it activating. The survivors felt the rescue team would soon be able to lock onto their position and get them out. In fact, the beacon did successfully activate and transmit a signal. However, the rescue operation did not go smoothly. Actually, when the plane failed to arrive at Belém Airport on time, the airport controller already sensed something was wrong. He reported the situation to his superiors. The airport went into an emergency state, and the corresponding rescue operation began. Investigator Ronaldo Jenkins, after receiving news that Flight 254 was missing, immediately began to study where the plane might have gone. Based on the information provided by the ground controller, eventually, the plane's last known position was determined to be near Belém. After all, at that time, the Flight 254 captain had said he was almost at the airport, so it should still be nearby. The rescue operation was launched near Belém. The result was predictable. No matter how hard they searched, they could not find the missing plane. So the question is, didn't we just say the plane's emergency beacon signal had been successfully transmitted? Why couldn't they find it? Because this signal's frequency was the same as signals emitted by many other devices. They checked several signal points near Belém, but they were not from Flight 254. If they expanded the search area to all of Brazil, there were simply too many of these signals. Who knew which one was from Flight 254? So for a time, the rescue team was completely stumped. Where on earth was the plane? After 2 days of frantic searching, the rescue teams still had nothing. Meanwhile, the survivors waiting in the rainforest were also bewildered. 2 days had passed. Why hadn't the rescue team arrived? Could it be that the emergency beacon signal wasn't received? If so, the problem was serious. In just 2 days, some of the seriously injured had already succumbed to their injuries. If they waited any longer, everyone might perish. They couldn't just sit and wait to die. They had to try to save themselves. And so, a search party composed of 4 brave men set out. They needed to walk out of the rainforest to seek help. Normally, in an unknown part of the rainforest, it's extremely easy to get lost, but they were very lucky. After walking for only 3 hours, they stumbled upon a farm called Curanare. However, this farm was relatively primitive. It had no radio equipment. The farm workers took the 4 men to another farm that had a radio, Serra de Prata. With the help of the radio operator, their distress signal was finally sent out. When the rescue team received the distress signal, they were overjoyed, but also surprised. Because the crash site was actually over 1,000 kilometers away from Belém. Belém was to the north, but the plane had crashed to the southwest, almost in the opposite direction. This baffled everyone. How did the plane fly so far off course? That afternoon at 4:27 p.m., the Brazilian Air Force dispatched an aircraft to the crash site of Flight 254. Since it was a dense forest, it was difficult for the aircraft to land, so the rescue team decided to first airdrop some emergency supplies and then clear a landing area nearby for the rescue. The next day, the rescue team cleared an area of nearly 100 square meters in the forest. All survivors were successfully rescued and sent to nearby hospitals. Unfortunately, due to the delay in the rescue operation, 5 people died from their injuries during the waiting period. Another person died in the hospital after rescue efforts failed. In the end, 12 of the 54 people on Flight 254 tragically died. Although 6 people died while waiting for rescue. Out of 54 people, 42 survived an emergency landing in a dark jungle. The survival rate was 77.78%. The news media widely reported this miracle, saying that Garcés had completed one of the most difficult forced landings in aviation history. As the captain who achieved this miracle, Garcés was hailed as a hero captain by the Brazilian people. Everyone believed it was his superb flying skills that saved so many lives. But was this really the case? The investigation into Flight 254 officially began on September 7th. This air crash was different from previous ones because the crash site was worlds apart from its intended destination. The captain had clearly said they were almost at Belém. Why did they suddenly appear thousands of kilometers away? Figuring this out was simple. Just ask the captain and first officer. Captain Garcés stated, "My flying skills are very good. I've never encountered this situation before. It must have been the plane's navigation and communication systems that failed, causing us to fly in the wrong direction. Later, we could only use commercial radio stations to get our bearings. We never found the airport. The plane ran out of fuel, so we had to make a forced landing in the rainforest." Hearing the captain's explanation, the investigation team immediately removed the plane's navigation system, communication system, and other instruments for testing. It's important to note that this type of aircraft, at that time, there were at least 30 others in Brazil, and many more around the world. If what the captain said was true, then all these planes posed a potential threat. But after testing, it was found that the navigation and communication systems were all normal. No problems. The investigation team even began to wonder if perhaps at the time there was some luggage with a strong magnetic field that caused the magnetic flux sensor in the plane's tail to fail. This sensor is very important. It acts like a compass, transmitting the information it collects to the cockpit instrument panel. If it failed, the plane's navigation system could indeed fail. But after scanning all the luggage found on the plane, this possibility was ruled out. Well then, let's look at the black boxes. Although Flight 254 broke apart, it did not catch fire, so the black boxes were well preserved. According to the data from the black boxes, the plane flew in the wrong direction from the very beginning. From Maraba Airport, it was supposed to fly north. However, the plane flew directly west. This is just absurd. Using data from the black box, Flight 254's actual flight path was this. First, it flew directly west, then it turned around and flew back, and finally, it followed the river south. The direction was completely wrong, leading them to be unable to find the airport, run out of fuel, and crash in the rainforest. This also explains why the plane couldn't contact Belém Airport via VHF radio and couldn't receive the Belém Airport beacon. They were too far apart. So the key question is, the plane flew in the wrong direction right after takeoff. Why were the captain and first officer completely unaware? Keep in mind, this wasn't their first time flying this route. The investigation team prepared to question the captain and first officer again, but their union surprisingly refused to cooperate. And the cockpit voice recorder only records the last 30 minutes of conversation. And the conversation from the last 30 minutes offered no clues, because by that time, they were already lost. The investigation team repeatedly studied the materials on hand, the flight plan, route maps, etc., and they actually found the source of the problem. The magnetic heading in the flight plan was 0270, which represented 27 degrees. But the flight heading the captain set was 270 degrees. This perfectly explains why the plane flew directly west. This was the trigger for the disaster. But for an experienced captain, it's unlikely he would make such a basic error. After their investigation, this is likely what happened. At the time, the captain received a paper flight plan. The magnetic heading was 4 digits, 0270. Why 4 digits? Because some advanced aircraft, in pursuit of precision, require accuracy to 1 decimal place. So 0270 meant 27.0 degrees. Although some aircraft models couldn't set 1 decimal place, for the sake of standardization, all flight plans used 4 digits. This regulation had only recently been changed in Brazil. Coincidentally, when this regulation was changed, Captain Garcés was on vacation, so he was unaware. And previously, it had always been 3 digits. And Flight 254 was an older model that could only be set to 3 digits. The captain, following his usual understanding, interpreted 0270 as 270 degrees and entered it into the system. Although this error was fatal, there were still many opportunities to correct it. For example, the first officer also sets the magnetic heading. This is inherently a safeguard measure, but First Officer Zil trusted the captain too much. He didn't set it according to the flight plan. Instead, he glanced at the captain's setting and just copied his homework, rendering this safeguard useless. Just like that, the two of them flew on the wrong heading. Logically, they should have been able to discover the wrong direction during the flight. After all, flying west means flying towards the sun. The sun had not set at that time, making it an easy reference. As an experienced flight crew, their sense of direction and geographical knowledge should naturally be unquestionable. This error should have been caught quickly. But in reality, they just didn't notice. So some speculate that the captain and first officer were secretly listening to the Brazil versus Chile match, which distracted them. But there is no evidence for this. It's just speculation. When they couldn't contact the Belém Tower or receive the Belém beacon, the captain still didn't realize the plane was lost. He just kept suspecting that the communication system was faulty. When the performance display showed they were almost at Belém, they were actually deep in the rainforest. It was uninhabited. So of course, they couldn't see the city lights or Belém Airport. At this point, the crew still didn't check if something was wrong, but blindly searched for the airport. When they realized they had overflown, they turned around and continued searching. Perhaps by this time they realized the plane was lost, but they didn't realize the severity of the problem. During this time, Flight 254 could have maintained contact with the outside world via VHF radio. If they had just asked for help, stating they were lost, perhaps what happened next could have been avoided. But they didn't do that. Instead, they kept trying on their own. This was, in fact, a gamble, taking the unwitting passengers and flight attendants along for the ride. The captain tried to lock onto Belém's local radio station, using the station to guide the plane back to the correct heading. Although they set the correct radio frequency, the station they found was not Belem's. We all know that between cities, different local radio stations sometimes use the same frequency. For example, Anhui has a 90.8, and other provinces also have a 90.8. After all, the frequency bands are limited. These stations also have a limited broadcast range. Flight 254 was very far from Belem at the time, so of course the station they locked onto was not the local one. Coincidentally, all Brazilian radio stations were broadcasting the Brazil vs. Chile match that day, so the captain subconsciously assumed he had found the right one. After flying for a while following the station's direction, they saw a large river. This was the north-south flowing Singu River, but the captain again subconsciously assumed this was the Amazon River, and then flew along the river. Finally, he mistakenly identified an airport over 1,000 kilometers to the south, Santarém Airport, as Maraba Airport. In short, during the 3+ hours of flying, they missed multiple chances for rescue. A series of errors caused the plane to run out of fuel and crash in the rainforest. If they had gotten just one thing right during the entire flight, the plane would not have crashed. After the investigation team figured this out, they found Captain Garcés again. Faced with the evidence, Garcés admitted he had made a mistake from the beginning, but he claimed it was unintentional. He later tried to save the plane, but unfortunately, he failed. When this investigation result was made public, the Brazilian public was in an uproar. Who had previously been hailed as a hero captain instantly became a villain. Captain Garcés and First Officer Zil, due to their errors during the flight, were sentenced to 4 years in prison. However, this was later commuted to community service. The captain's pilot license was revoked, although First Officer Zil's pilot license was not. Given this incident, almost no airline was willing to hire him. In fact, during the investigation, the captain and first officer also blamed each other. First Officer Zil later co-authored a book about this ordeal. He believed the fault lay mainly with the captain, and that he himself had done nothing wrong. He claimed the captain repeatedly rejected his suggestions and ignored his opinions. As for Captain Garcés, he was more low-key afterward. He did not respond to Zil, but the discord between the two was very obvious. As for what really happened between them, we will never know. Of course, the Belem ground controller also bore responsibility. He should have reported the anomaly. As soon as Flight 254 failed to arrive on time. But what happened? He was listening to the Brazil vs. Chile match while directing aircraft. While multitasking, he delayed reporting the incident. Regarding this accident, aviation consultant John Cox believed the two pilots did not demonstrate the professionalism required. In this regard, they were unqualified. The actions of this flight crew can serve as a very good case study to warn other flight crews not to make the same mistake in the future. Why did this captain make one mistake after another? Aviation psychologist Kathleen Mosier believes the captain likely suffered from confirmation bias. This means that once he confirmed a certain belief, he wouldn't easily admit he was wrong, but would desperately search for various pieces of information to support his belief. In layman's terms, he was unwilling to admit his mistake, afraid to admit his mistake. Although, for this disaster, the flight crew indeed bears the primary responsibility. The airline cannot be absolved of blame either. A few months after the accident, the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations conducted a test. They sent Flight 254's flight plan to 21 pilots from major airlines around the world. The result, 15 pilots made the same mistake, interpreting 0270 as 270 degrees. Clearly, the notation itself was problematic. Later, to prevent similar incidents from happening again, the airline decided to just add a decimal point. 27 degrees would be written as 27.0. Wouldn't it have been better to do this from the start? The changes didn't stop there. After the accident, Brazil upgraded its radar system nationwide. This way, they could monitor aircraft positions across the entire country. However, this upgrade, paid for with accidents and human lives, is inevitably tinged with sadness. Alright, that concludes the story of the Varig Flight 254 crash. If you like my videos, you can like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss any of my videos. See you next time.